Let's take a look at an interesting special effect we can render with blogger post. Here we see the background and our cursor. Once our cursor moves into these areas, at the beginning nothing happens, but if we click on this image, special effects start to happen. We move our mouse and it rotates. We move our mouse in a different direction, it rotates accordingly. So depending on our mouse, this glass panel is rotating on the X and Y axis, and you see the detail on the edge, and the shadow looks like it is a 3D glass panel. And once our mouse moves away, the texts move down. The opacity is also changing once our cursor is inside this frame. Now let's look at the code, how the blogger renders this special effect. This code has three parts: the HTML, style sheet, and finally the JavaScript. As you can see, the JavaScript uses a Vue framework, and the framework finds the element with ID up and start to apply this template. The template is applied to the special tag named card, and this is a template used to replace the tag named card. And let's take a look at this card element inside the HTML code. You see this card is not a standard HTML element, and it has a variable data image, and it has two code snippets tagged by slot. They are later used by the template to generate HTML code. So let's jump back to the JavaScript. And the top layer dev have those things. They responding to mouse move event, mouse enter event, and mouse leave event, and there are three functions defined later to handle those events. We can reference this dev with ref card, and wrapped inside we have a dev with class card, and their style sheet is generated dynamically. Inside that we have another layer of dev, classes card background, and style sheet again is generated dynamically. And there is a sibling called card info, classes card info. There's two slots which is defined in the early HTML code with slot header and slot content. And once the page is mounted, the two variables are defined, the width and the height. They got from this dev because it have ref card. The offset width, offset height is used to define the width and the height. And the data image, which defined in the HTML code, data image is later used to generate the variables used in the template. Specifically, they use to generate the background image. Okay, the background image is defined here. Let's read from top down. The computed, as you see, the color style is a variable in the template. Color style is a variable in the template. When the view process this code, it will replace this code with this CMS code. This CSS code decides to rotate X and rotate Y degree. And there are two variables. A variable which is calculated with another variable. This variable is decided with this variable and this variable. Those two variables are dynamic according to the cursor's location. So when our cursor moves, the CSS code returned changes. That's why we get a different rotation degree on the Y and the X when we move the mouse. Okay, let's keep reading. For the card background, we have the card background transform and a card background image. We have two pieces of CSS code we need to generate. Let's take a look at card background transform. Again, this is a CSS code we need to return, which is translator X, translator Y. So the background moves on the Y-axis and the X-axis a certain pixel according to our mouse location. You see the mouse location PY, PX, PY eventually decided by our mouse position. So the background image is moving on the Y-axis, X-axis accordingly. Finally, the card background image, this is a CSS code returned, and it uses the data image URL we defined in the HTML code we saw at the top. Alright, now we see how the mouse movement affects the CSS dynamically. Next, let's take a look at the CSS code. Again, let's take a look at some example. Mouse move event is handled by this function. Let's take a look at this function in the method. Handle mouse move. When the mouse moves, this event, we get a page X. Use that to set the mouse X and mouse Y. They became variable once those two variables values are set. This is how our mouse move events translated to two variables used by the JavaScript, which eventually defines the CSS code. And mouse enter, mouse leave, we do some initialization for the mouse original position, and we clear the timeout. Some CSS code. Let's go back to look at some animation. interesting animation, CSS code. Those animation changes opacity and the text position, etc. First, the ID, the element with ID app got its color, background color. That's how this color came from, because the ID app got applied with this CSS code. Then the title, the element with class title, get a special font family which is imported with this CSS link. The P or the P element get this line height, and any element behind header and any P element behind the P element get this margin top. But we don't have P element in this code anyway. And container class, okay, the container class, which is the dev, the first layer of dev, they get a padding, they got a flex, so any inner dev is aligned horizontally. And the called wrapper class get a 3D perspective, and it get a 3D effect. And once our pointer move into the dev, it changes to special cursor. As you see, yeah, it changed to special cursor. That is this CSS do. And once we have once we hover over the card wrap, anything inside with class card info is put to the 0 position on the y-axis. Okay, that's fine. Card info. Okay, I think this is card info. This put it to the 0 position. No matter where we move, this thing doesn't move. And okay, when we have a card wrap, anything inside of this class card info. If they have P, they have capacity. Okay, we don't have P, doesn't matter. When we hover over the card wrap, any element with class card info, when we have the mouse hover, any elements inside with class card info, if they have any P, whatever, they get this special animation effect, and it applies this special transition curve. Okay, so the transition is gradually, it follows a special curve, so it looks like a physics movement, as if we apply a gravity. And again, when we have hover and any class inside, if they have elements after that element, they also get applied for during 5 seconds. They apply the transition animation and change the opacity to 1. They'll put to the 0 position. Card wrap, card info, anything after the card info, those things. Those things is behind the card info. They are put to the 0 position as well. And they get 5 seconds animation. That's the reason they're rising up. You see, they're rising up and sink down with animation. So those are defined with with this animation, and we have hover. We have the hover and any elements inside with class equal color background. They get this nice transition animation, and change the opacity, and again anything inside they have the class equal card, a box shadow is applied, and the box shadow is changed gradually, and that's those shadows we see around. And finally we have those card have box shadow, and card background. Okay, basically that's how the special effect is generated. We have a view framework which dynamically changes the CSS code when the mouse is moving inside this div, and we see special effect like rotation, and the text rise up and down, and the opacity changes, whatever. That is all renderable by the blogger post. All we have to do is copy this code and put it into the post editor. One thing to notice, the code editor have two modes. The HTML mode and the compose mode. If we shift between those two modes, the blogger editor will replace the ampersand with HTML escape code. That will mess up the JavaScript view framework, because in the JavaScript uses this string as a variable, and if this is escaped, the JavaScript code will break. So when you switch back and forth between HTML and the compose mode, bear in mind these characters could be replaced and mess up your JavaScript code.